what he's got to do?
Well, no, it's difficult to answer it. There's no kind of order of procedure established about it. The way I believe that the motion picture is a collective contribution of all the people involved in creating it. I usually spend several months with the writer, 2-3 months with the writer, just discussing the story, discussing the themes, the characters, the situations, the scenes in general, the line of the story, just spending day in, day out, doing nothing but discussing the possibilities of the script. That usually takes 2 to 3 months. Then the writer sits down by himself and composes the first treatment. It's not in screenplay form, it's in a dramatic treatment form, commenting on his own approach rather than on the picture as a whole. And it usually reaches, let's say, between 70 and 100 pages. Then we meet again and try to analyze whether it really does comprehensively include everything that the original story had in it.
You were a scriptwriter once yourself, weren't you?
Yes, I began my interest in movies by very, very many years ago.
Do you ever find that your own experiences as a scriptwriter encourage you to make suggestions to the man you've employed as a scriptwriter which are against his better judgment?
Well, when they are against his better judgment, I expect him to prove his point of view. The whole, having stated before that I consider a motion picture a collective contribution, I very often put myself into a position of a devil's advocate against my own opinions. When the author has them, when the author, the script writer, is the devil's advocate, then I don't have to be it myself. I seriously believe that the best scripts emerge out of the friction between the people who work on them. It wouldn't be true to state that any picture has been prepared properly without frantic discord between the writer, the producer, and the director. Everyone wrestling with his own doubts, wrestling with my doubts, and trying to come to a conciliation of 3 opinions as 3 creative minds working on a certain scene. The best possible scene emerges from the friction that we invest that scene with. Scenes arrived at very calmly and serenely are usually very dull because they lack the acidity or the sharpness that gets into them out of friction.
It's been said of you, Mr. Spiegel, by one of the scriptwriters who's worked very closely with you, and I shan't say who it is, that 3/4 of your artistic ideas are nonsense, and that 1/4 of them is pure genius, and that one has to listen through the 3/4 in order not to miss the 1/4. Now, would you say there was any truth in that?
Well, this would, if I had admitted to that, I would disqualify 3/4 of myself to any scriptwriter in the future. I frankly believe that any good picture, any contribution of a writer to a picture, if it's 1/4 of what he has written remains in it, that's a magnificent contribution. I wish it were true that 1/4 of what I invest of my talent into a picture is really good. I believe that that is overstating it. Nobody can be that good. As a matter of fact, in every script that we have worked on, a very much smaller fraction than 25% of our contribution remained in it finally.
Now, you work with with four at least of the industry's, I suppose, finest directors: David Lean, Kazan, Mankiewicz, and Huston. Now, would you say there was anything to choose between them as regards work and method?
No, there's an enormous amount of difference between each one of them. That's what makes them good directors. Each one has his own individual aptitudes and approaches, which sort of are the mark of their various individual talents. I wouldn't choose any differently in these four pictures with these four directors than I have chosen, because, for instance, African Queen, we used Huston's wonderful facility for making exotic situations seem very real and very believable. Mankiewicz, and suddenly last summer, he's one of the few directors who have the sophistication to take a very literate subject written by Tennessee Williams and make actors speak it believably. This has nothing to do with the exoticism of the surroundings. It has more to do with the believability of unusual situations in very literate surroundings. Kazan is the master of social stress on people, stressing the impact of social conditions on their daily behavior. Now, David Lean is probably the best director in the world to combine, to blend the beauty of the background with the impact of the human being in front of that enormous background, without letting the background sort of weigh down on the small human being in front of that enormous background. He was the only man who could have done the jungle next to a prison camp look proportionate enough rather than disproportionate.
Looking back over the last 15 or 20 years of your career, what would you say was the turning point in it?
Well, it's a very personal question. I hope it will not be resented any place, and comes as a surprise to me at this point. The turning point in my career was the moment I decided to leave California and to come into a more pulsating center of the world. I think one of the problems with making pictures in Hollywood was the kind of isolation that you live in, away from all the events of the world. I came to London to prepare African Queen in 1951, and I've never returned to California. I left my home there and never returned into it. All the pictures which I've made since were made with my fingers on the pulse of events. While I was living in California, I was making them through the kind of a second-hand impulse. And I feel this was the turning point, and it doesn't mean that it's an accusing finger pointed at Hollywood. Technically, Hollywood is still the best center to make pictures in. Emotionally, socially, I think pictures should not be centered in one place. They should be made where events occur, where stories take place.
Did you always want to produce, or did it happen sort of accidentally?
Embarrassing questions. I really didn't intend to be a producer when I first started in motion pictures. I thought I'll be a writer. And very early in my career in motion pictures, I discovered that the only way to have some controlling sense of the destiny of a movie is to be either a director or a producer. Since I don't think that I would make a good director, because I'm technically completely inadequate. I have no sense of machinery, no understanding for it. I've never attempted to be one. It is a hankering of most writers or producers to be directors. Mine it never was. I always wanted to become a producer.
Do you think that you're a better producer than you were a writer?
I sincerely think I am, because I do involve myself sufficiently in the writing to contribute what I can, and I have a better sense of the whole by being a producer. The one thing I occasionally resent is that in the public mind, the producer is usually the man who controls the financial end of the picture. Since I never do and manage to discharge my duties without doing it, I somehow live down the odium of that part of being a producer.
Now, in your early days as a producer, your credit on the screen used to come up as S.P. Eagle. What was the reason for that?
Well, this was during the transition from being a writer into being a producer. There was a certain reluctance to admit, or a certain hesitancy about identifying myself with my own name. Gradually, I discarded it and consider it kind of a silly prank, which I regret occasionally.
What is the most important single thing that really gives you satisfaction as a producer? Is it the power and influence you have on other people? Is it taking risks? Is it making money? Or is it creating something? Or is it none of these?
Well, it is probably a little bit of all of this. It would be dishonest to say that the power is not a force that all of us occasionally are tempted to embrace. Money, when it comes, it is always very useful and helpful. Creating pictures which are important to people the world over and yet bring you money and power, that is really the ultimate pleasure in it all. So the creative end of it is ultimately probably the most important.
Which of all the films you've made so far would you say have given you the greatest satisfaction?
If I single one out, I'll offend the others. But I'll say, to me personally, it is not the most successful of them all, but the one that I derived a sense of having made a contribution. And that was On the Waterfront, because of its theme and of its impact. It was an honest story in terms of American negative values that presented to the world faults of which people should not be ashamed of, but which people should try to correct. And while it became a tremendous success the world over, it never reduced the value of American prestige abroad. I was very proud of that.
Well, Mr. Spiegel, you're a very successful man. You've been called the last of the great tycoons. You live in fine style, you have a collection of beautiful paintings, you like good food and drink and the company of women. With all this, are you a happy man?
I think that there is no such thing as a completely happy human being. The one happiness I can admit to is that I have, in the last 30 years, never done anything that I didn't want to do. I haven't done movies I didn't want to make. I haven't committed acts I didn't want to commit. I haven't associated myself with causes I didn't have to associate myself with. And as such, I'm probably as happy as a man can be.